Why is King Snefru so famous? What was he famous for? And why did he build so many pyramids? What do we know about the pyramids that he built? So let's dig into this. And I'll say up front, thank you to those of you who support me. I very much appreciate it. I'll mention again, thank you to those who've looked at this and looked at this book. I do have a book, Religion of the Black Land. It's available now on Amazon. You can get it as a Kindle, as an ebook you can download. You can get it as a paperback, $14.99. You can get that and take a look at it. It goes over some historic documents from an ancient Kemetic perspective and an ancient Kushite perspective. The Asarian Tell, the Victory Stele of Pianki, the Shabaka Stone, goes over a number of these things to examine them to see what can we get out of it today? How can we apply these things to our lives today? And that's how I want to jump into this subject as we talk about King Snefru and why is he famous? What was he famous for? And what can we learn about him? I don't just want to talk about King Snefru from the standpoint of just the things and material things. I want to dig a little deeper to get an understanding of it. So let's jump right into it. As we started to talk about King Snefru, we are talking about the king who is accredited with starting the fourth dynasty of ancient Kemet. He is credited with kicking off the fourth dynasty, and we know the dynasties were separated by a priest in Egypt during the Greco-Roman times, on the Greco times. He was the one who kind of put forth the idea of dynasties, but we kind of use that as a way for us to kind of have a perspective now. So King Snefru is the person who is credited with starting the fourth dynasty, at the head of the fourth dynasty will. So when we talk about this, I have this document and this resource that I'm working on that I plan on giving to members. So if you are a member here on YouTube or Facebook, a paid member, it's $4.99 a month. For those who want to pay for $9.99, I very much appreciate it. This document will be available to you very shortly as I kind of give it to you, because I want you to be able to read more than just a cursory thing. So as we think about it, King Snefru lived from he really reigned, if you will, from about 2575 BC to about 2551 BC. So we're talking 2,500 years before Christ. So well over 4,500 years ago, this is when he lived. And so we're talking about someone who lived a long time ago. He's living during the fourth dynasty, kicking off the fourth dynasty, as I said. And as you think about the fourth dynasty obviously comes after the third dynasty, right? And you start to see one of the major things that happened in the third dynasty is you saw the development of the step pyramid. That's one of the most famous things there by the famous architect and renowned genius Imhotep, who built the step pyramid for King Doja in the third dynasty of ancient Kemet. So King Snefru comes along after that. And so he might have been the son of the last king of the third dynasty, but there is a connection there and a relation in some way. So he comes along after the step pyramid. He's, as I mentioned, he's about 2,500 years before Christ. So he's well over 4,500 years ago. He lived, and he is credited with kicking off a whole era, if you will, in the fourth dynasty. So what did he do, and why is he famous, and what do we kind of know him for? As we kind of look at this and kind of delve into this topic, one of the things we think about, we start to look at him, and I want to give you some dates here to kind of give you some things off the top to let you know why he's famous, because you're looking right here at his grandson, right here, the person who's most likely his grandson. So we look at this. Snefru, as I mentioned, was reigned in ancient Kemet from about 2575 BC to about 2551 BC. His son Khufu, i.e. the builder, that is the builder of the famous Great Pyramid in ancient Kemet, the Great Pyramid, is his son Khufu. So he was Khufu's dad, right? And Khufu reigned from about 2551 thereabouts to about 2528. That's the end. And then Khufu's son Khafre was from about 2520 to 2494, and it's believed that the Sphinx is made of from Khafre, that's an image and a reflection of and a remembrance of Khafre. That's what it's believed, because where it's built right there in that pyramid complex. That's what's believed. So essentially, Snefru is Khafre's granddad. This guy's granddad, right? And he's Khufu's father. And when you think about the other lines of succession of people like Nebka, who's credited with being and recognized as being a king in the fourth dynasty, and Menkaure, you find that Menkaure is the builder of the third Great Pyramid. So you have Khufu with the first Great Pyramid, you have Khafre with the second Great Pyramid there in Giza, and then Menkaure, who is Khafre's son and Khufu's grandson and Snefru's great-grandson. So you start to see the Snefru is at the head of a line of some very famous people, of people who were accomplished and went down in history. And he had some things that he contributed in of himself. So when you start to think about why he's famous, you start to think about the line in the fourth dynasty that he helped to kick off and some of the things he did with his life there. So I want to kind of jump into a couple of things because, as we mentioned, and we talk about, and I'll kind of jump into this later in terms of the names of Snefru, because there are Kemetic kings, especially as they approach the fifth dynasty, even in the first dynasty and the third dynasty and in the fourth dynasty, they had more than one name. And sometimes, you would find that person's name would be written, one of the names might be written someplace and another name might be written there, and you had to put it together as you kind of looked and piece these things together, which history is often like that, right? But I wanted to jump into a couple things as we talk about, because he was Snefru, the he of the two ladies, and Ma'at, referring to Ma'at and his soul reflecting Ma'at, referring to Ma'at was one of his names that he had. But as we talk about that, I want to kind of jump into a little bit about the Palermo stone, because there are some documents that give us some information about King Snefru, which I think are important for us to look at. And as we think about that, King Snefru was somebody, as I mentioned, in the fourth dynasty. There's this famous stone, and you can look it up. You can read the stone. You can look at it. It's the Palermo stone, and it was held in Italy, in Sicily, the island of Sicily, and the city of Palermo, which is a part of Italy, right? And so that's why it's called the Palermo stone, which I think is kind of funny. A lot of these ancient Kemetic things that are found, they are named after European cities, but there you go, or other people, and not actually after the people whose names or likeness or reference there is that history is talking about. But the Palermo stone has a reference of Snefru, but not just Snefru. It has references to several of the first several kings and the first several dynasties of ancient Kemet, and it's like an annals. It says what they did in a year, in those years that were recorded in those animals on those annals in the Palermo stone. And the Palermo stone at one point in time was actually something that looked at every 2 years, because it coincided with when they did a cattle, if you will, accounting of the resources in ancient Kemet. So at first it was every 2 years, and then it moved to every year. So it doesn't, all of the numbers don't line up to every year. It aligns up to when they were doing additional things with respect to administration in ancient Kemet. But the Palermo stone mentions Snefru, and it's very interesting. As I mentioned, he's the first king of the fourth dynasty. And this is an annals of a stone, as I mentioned, that's in Italy. That's why it gets the name after the city Palermo in Sicily, in Italy. And it is it mentions a number of things about him. It mentions, how he's building barges and he's building, boats for trips that he's going to make. But it also talks about this interesting thing right here. It talks about, kind of a war, which apparently was a war and an expedition that King Snefru did during his reign, where he went into Nubia. And this is most likely lower Nubia, not Kush, not Yam, in the upper part of the southern part of Nubia, whereas today, northern Sudan, not that far down in the a little farther north than that, and what will be today's southern Kemet, which would be Nubia. It was Nubia. And so in Lower Nubia, and it talks about him, hacking up the land and cutting up the land and taking back some 7,000 prisoners, if you will, 7,000 prisoners from this exhibition that they went through in Nubia. And you think about that, 7,000 living persons, that's what it said, and 200,000 large cattle and small cattle. So whether those numbers are exactly right or whether they're exaggerated, this is one of the pieces of documents and evidence that people talk about when they talk about the Old Kingdom, and they talk about Snefru, and they talk about the Old Kingdom dominating Nubia, right? You don't have a whole lot of records that says over a period of thousands of years, this is what ancient Kemet is doing. So we go back up here and we see, 2575, we're not necessarily seeing year after year after year, all these things talking about ancient Kemet, dominating Nubia. You see pieces of information, because we're talking 4,500 years ago, pieces of information, right? And this is one of the major pieces of information that people talk about with respect to ancient Kemet and Nubia, and there being war there, and that Egypt was dominating Nubia. A lot of times they say that off of scant evidence, but this is significant though, because he's talking about there, and we're gonna take him at his word. We don't have all these documents to go back, and we don't have living records and things to go back to look at all. We're gonna take him at his word that he went into Nubia and he took back 7,000 prisoners, and he brought back hundreds of thousands of cattle, because cattle was so important in ancient Kemet and so important in Nubia, so important in Nile Valley. It's like a walking kind of kitchen and grocery store, if you will, because you could produce food and milk and so many things, and have obviously babies that you could have more and more food from. But when you think about this, one of the things that jumps out at me, because I'm going to assume that he did this, that the fight took place and that they won, and that ancient Kemet dominated Nubia during this fight, and that he took back some 7,000, thousands of people. When you think about that, when I read the ancient Kemetic literature, there's so much literature that talks about them interacting with so many different people. This idea, and I see people put it forth all the time, they will say there were no black people in ancient Kemet. There were no Nubians that had anything to do with ancient Kemet. There wasn't even any Nubians at all. I mean, I literally have people posting that in various things that I post, and I'm sitting there looking at something like this. How can you look at something like this, which is a document that I didn't write, right? That was written a long time before I lived, a long time before I was born, that says 7,000 people came from Nubia into ancient Kemet during the Old Kingdom 4,500 years before Christ. Now, we already know that there were black people all up and down the Nile. We already know that. But just looking at this evidence in this particular document, saying that 7,000 prisoners, what happened to those people? Like, what happened? Did they just disappear? Did they not have children? What's the likelihood that these people who were brought as living prisoners, who would be men and women, they probably are not all men, that's not how it worked, would not have children, would not also have intercourse and interrelations with people who were already there in Kemet? Just because they were having interrelations doesn't mean that people in Kemet were ethnically different. It just means they were from a different society at that time, and societies that had differentiated themselves. What's the likelihood that they did not mix? What's the likelihood they didn't mingle? I mean, this whole idea that there were not black people doesn't even fly in the face of the documents there. You know, anytime, and I look at it, when you read this, ancient Kemetic people didn't just go into Nubia, right? They went into what is today Lebanon. They went into places east and west of them. They went to places obviously far south, because we have so much records and so many records of that. You find an area where it's a great mixing pot. People are mixing. And just because they're from different societies doesn't mean they're always different ethnically. But they're from people from different societies who probably also had differences there are mixing. And to me, it's one of the great testaments that somehow they found a way to live, right? And not based on race, not hating each other based on race. You never see ancient Kemetic people talking about they hate somebody because of their race. Right. That's something that's a relatively new construct in history that within the last 500 years, with something that Europeans have really put out and other people put out within the last 500 years. It hasn't been something that went on thousands of years ago. It's actually a true testament that you could have people from different societies, different backgrounds come together and live. Right. And in some situations, some were dominating others. In other situations, the thing was reversed. But there's no way in the world that these people didn't mix. There's no way in the world that even with this record alone, not looking at any other things that make you have common sense, there's no other way. There's no way that these people didn't mix. There's no way that you have thousands of people in ancient Kemet living their lives, coming in whatever capacity. Because not only did they bring prisoners from Nubia, they brought prisoners from what they call Asiatics, and they would call the Asiatics wretched people, just like they called Nubian people. And it wasn't because of the Asiatic people race. It wasn't because of Nubians race that they called them wretched. They called them wretched because they were fighting them, right? They didn't call people who were from Asia or people who were Bedouin or people who were from what we consider Libya in the west of ancient Kemet. They didn't call them wretched and all these bad names because of their race, right? They weren't being racist. They were being, politically, they were saying we are the strongest ones in this area. We are the strongest kings, and we're going to kill everybody, put everybody under our feet. That's what they were saying, under our feet. And so this idea speaks to me of societies that mingle in all kinds of ways, because we're going to look at other documents. We're not just going to look at this one. This is just the one we're looking at today. There are other documents shortly after this that talk about there being many, many Nubian people in the army in the Old Kingdom. I'm not just talking New Kingdom. I'm not even just talking Middle Kingdom, Mentuhotep II, because he had Nubian wives and Nubian soldiers. I'm not just talking about him, as well as other things that we'll look at it, or even the New Kingdom, or even the Kushite people. In the Old Kingdom, shortly after this time, you find documented evidence of Nubian people serving as mercenaries, not as prisoners, not as servants, as soldiers, right? You don't bring people in your army and have them in large number, in significant number, because it lists the Urjak and the Wawet and many different people, types of people. And that's another thing. It wasn't just one type of Nubian. These were different, distinct peoples. And we just sometimes put them all in an area, and we look at the area, and the Kemetic people were referring to an area or group, but understood that they were different people under different societies, under different leadership, because they called them by different names, right? They gave them their names. They called them by the names that they called them. They didn't give them their names. They called the name by names, the Urjet, the Wawet. They gave names of people and names of different types of people, different peoples that lived there. There were more than just one type of Nubian. And this is just Lower Nubia. I'm not even talking about Kush and Yam and the places farther south and in the third cataract of Nile. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking between the first cataract to the second cataract of the Nile. And so we find that you have soldiers of large numbers in ancient Kemet fighting in their wars. So when you see some of these wars that we talk about, that we mentioned for ancient Kemet, and they destroyed people, or they went to the Asiatics, or they destroyed, a lot of times they had Nubian people in the army. When Mentuhotep supposedly went to take over part of Lower Kemet from Upper Kemet to kind of bring it under one rule again, he had Nubian soldiers in his army. You had Nubians fighting Kemetic people fighting Kemetic people. You had all of these things mixing, and you had people from that whole area mixing. So it wasn't the way people share it. And I wanted to kind of point that out because I think that's a significant thing when it comes to Snefru, that he's talking about interacting with Nubian people and bringing thousands of them. And as this document mentioned on the Palermo stone, which you can look up, read, don't just take my word for it, read it. And you have to put your own analysis to it, right? Because you're reading something that's so long ago, that the likelihood that these 7,000 people, dispersed and disappeared and never left any record of themselves, never had children, never intermarried with anybody in Kemet, never went and did anything else, and is very unlikely. And that's just one example. And as I mentioned, there are also other examples with Mentuhotep, with the New Kingdom, in the Old Kingdom, Nubian people being in soldiers, with trade going on. And the trade that existed between Nubia and ancient Kemet existed before Kemet was a country, existed before 2500 BC, before 3100 BC, long before that. There was a Nile Valley system of trade already going up and down the Nile, many, many years, hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, probably thousands of years before ancient Kemet became an official political entity. That people already traveled. People have been around for human ancestors have been around for millions of years in this part of the world. The likelihood that human beings have gone up and down the Nile Valley for many thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years is clear, right? And the likelihood that they interacted, that they shared things is clear and is evident. So I kind of wanted to share that as we talk about, but let's move on. Let's talk about more about King Snefru, because not only does he have this Palermo stone that references him, that talks about him, there's also a wonderful piece of wisdom literature. So one of the things you think about when you talk about ancient Kemet and you talk about some of the things it did, you think about is wisdom literature. So we see a lot of the literature from other places in the world, and it's good. It's good to get information and wisdom wherever you can get it from all different societies, from all different ancestors. So let's get that information. But when you look at ancient Kemet, we overlook that wisdom literature. We overlook some of the things that they do and some of the things that they said. And this whole idea of giving instructions, like the instructions of Ptahhotep and the instructions of Kajemni, which we're about to look at, and the instructions of Merkari, which I've talked about. These are things, a certain class of Kemetic literature that talked about giving instructions, maybe from a father to a son, or from somebody who was already in a position of authority and wisdom, giving that to somebody who might be taking on that position. Those types of things were done quite a bit in ancient Kemet. And there's a whole list of them, a whole long list of that type of literature, which we should talk about and study. So we're going to talk about the teachings of Kajemni. And this was something that was apparently attributed to a man who was an official and would become an official under the King Huni, who was the last king of the third dynasty, and King Snefru. So this was written or attributed to the time of King Snefru. And it might have been reworked and refurbished, if you will, later on, because this was a long time, like 4,500 years ago. So it was reworked over the 3,000 years of Kemetic history. But it's attributed to this time when King Snefru lived and his predecessor. And so this is instructions to a man whose name is Kajemni, who's translated as Kajemni, and he's going to become a vizier. He's going to become an official, and he's beginning to get instructions. And the first part of this is lost. The first part of it is not, it was kind of destroyed. And it's also included in a papyrus that includes the teaching of Ptahhotep. So it's very interesting. These things are included together, but you don't have the first part of the teachings of Kajemni. But I want to share it. And you also, and when you have the second part of this papyrus, you have the teachings of Ptahhotep, which is more intact, which made it even more famous, because it was, you can kind of read it from beginning to end. And Kajemni is kind of fragmented, if you will, because part of it was lost. Part of the papyrus was lost. But in this instruction, he talks about, the cautious man is flourishing. He's one who flourishes. And the exact one is one who is praised, that the innermost chamber of your heart is open to the man of silence. And when I think about it, he's saying, so when you're cautious, if you're taking your time, if you're thoughtful about your actions, your heart is open. You're going to be You're going to be praised if you're thoughtful about it. But when you're a person of silence, your chamber, the innermost chamber of your heart is open to a man of silence. When I think about this, your innermost chamber be open. And I think about it from your heart, but also from, from a very physical standpoint. If you know when to shut up, when not to talk, you probably have an ability to make speech be your servant. And you can be a person who can speak wisely when you come in front of people, and you have people open doors for you when they see and recognize your worth. But also I think about it from the standpoint of the innermost chambers of your heart being open. That whole idea about silence. We think a lot about yoga. We think a lot about different types of spiritual practices, and they involve mantraing, they involve meditation, and the Kemetic people had spiritual words of power. They had prayers. They had all kinds of things that they recited and they did. This whole idea of mantraing and being able to be appropriate and appreciative of silence is something that comes through. Even when you think about our men as being an expression of God, whom we've talked about, when we think about netterology and netter, that whole idea of what's hidden, that idea of what's silent, that idea of knowing what to speak, that idea of speaking truth, speaking ma'at, is all there in Kemetic literature. And they're kind of touching on that and why it's important to be silent and make speech your servant here. And we can look at ancient Kemet as having legitimate spiritual practices that we can learn from. Doesn't mean you don't learn from yoga or from different places around the world. It doesn't mean you don't learn from them and accept those things that are true, those things that are right with your spirit, those things that God revealed to you. But we can learn from there too. So it's something that we can share and talk about and think about. And so then he also talks about, if you are a gentle person, the seat is open to you. Things are open and they're wide to you. But if you are a person who's forceful, knives are prepared for you. If you are somebody who uses and acts by force, you're going to automatically create enemies. If you become somebody who controls your speech and knows when to be silent and knows when to talk, you will have somebody where the chambers will open to you. But if you come with forcefulness, if you come in the wrong way, there will be knives prepared against you. You'll be somebody who will not advance in your season because you're going to create enemies if you don't know how to shut your mouth or hold your mouth. And a lot of people know how that's discipline. Being able to hold your tongue is discipline. He talks about when you sit with people, don't eat all the bread that you like. Don't be gluttonous, because if you be glutton, a person who is a base person is governed by his belly. And that you see a lot of that written in Proverbs. You see a lot of that written in various wisdom type of language and literature, that being controlled by your desires will make you become base. It will make you be somebody who will do things that are inappropriate when you let your desires lead you. That shouldn't be what leads you. God should be what's leading you. You should be led by your mind. You should be led by your spirit, and not led by things, by your desires. Because if you led by your desires, even by your hunger, you're going to find that you're going to be doing things you don't want to do. Don't get caught in that, is what he's saying. So, he's saying be open to people when they are open to you, when they offer you things, be open to them. And he talks about if a man is lacking good fellowship, no speech or any type of speech can influence him. And I think about good fellowship in terms of good manners, but I also think about it, and sometimes people suffer from depression. So I thought about that as I was just reading that, his face might be sour toward those who are friendly with him and who are kind with him. And he's a grief to his mother and his father and to his friends. And so somebody who lacks manners, right, is going to be somebody who is a pain to be around. Somebody who you should not have as a friend, is what they're saying. And they're going to be a pain to be around. They're going to be embarrassment to their family. And that's somebody you should be careful about. For me, when I think about it, if somebody has depression, because sometimes you're going to find people who are depressed, who can't really open their mouths, who can't really speak their pain, you're going to find that sometimes the things you do may not be able to shake them. Prayer is going to be needed. Help will be needed. Professional help might be needed. Whatever you can do. But sometimes you're going to meet people who might be going through a lot, and they may need a lot of help. They may need your prayer. They may need your support. And I've said this to someone, sometimes people need help to get help. Right? Somebody who might be fighting depression may not know how to get the help they need, and they don't know how to make the phone calls or how to sometimes people need help to get help. And sometimes you could be a help to let somebody else get the help they need. So God bless you if you're in that place and you can do that for somebody. And then he talks about don't be boastful and arrogant if you are strong among soldiers. If you happen to be a mighty man or a mighty person among young people, and don't be arrogant, because you do not know. If you start to stir up strife, you don't know the things that God will do when God punishes. It says, because you know, if not the things that God will do when God punishes. If you are arrogant and you start to stir up trouble, you don't want to do that, because you don't know how God's going to get you when it's time to get you. So it begins to talk about them the advisor here talked about, he brings his children around, and the children read what's in this book, and in this Teachings of Kajimni, which was written during the time of Snefru. The children read this book and they fall on their bellies, and they say to their dad, they say, this is the best thing we've ever read. This is the best thing. And here you have an example. As I think about fathers, and we honor Father's Day, and mothers, and we honor Mother's Day, we honor our ancestors and our parents. I think about the idea of children reading the words of their ancestors, reading the words of their fathers, and respecting them. How many people have and have not read the autobiography of Malcolm X? How many people have and have not read the books that Martin Luther King read, or many things that people have left behind that can give us words of wisdom? Some of us read, some of us we don't. So that whole idea of children respecting their parents, respecting their grandparents, remembering their ancestors, and reading the words of their ancestors was also talked about in this document that was written during King Snefru's time. So that's kind of how it ends when he talks about that, and it begins to talk about, this was something that he was gracious, and it talks about at the very end of this document, it talks about how Kajimni was under the king of Huni, who was the last king of the third dynasty. And it talks about how Snefru became the gracious king and ruled over the land. So you actually have King Snefru's name mentioned in this document, the instructions of Kajimni. So it becomes a significant document. You start to see that King Snefru had several things associated with him that makes you know that he was famous, makes you know that, he was there, and and why he was famous. And the Palermo stone that we talked about, the instructions of Kajimni we talked about, and now we're going to talk about his pyramids, right? Why did he build these pyramids? Like, what did he do when it came to pyramids? Because he is famous for building not only this pyramid you see here, which could be called the red pyramid, but also the bent pyramid, which is an amazing structure. When you just look at it, it has two different inclinations, if you will, which gives it that bent-like structure, if you will. But he is credited with building actually several pyramids. One, he may have been the person who refurbished King Huni's, the last king of the third dynasty. He may have been the person who refurbished his pyramid and kind of made it a true pyramid. He may have been the person he's credited with doing that. Refurbishing that. And then he went to Dashur, which is in the northern part of ancient Kemet, kind of in that Hector Memphis area, if you will. And he went in the northern part to Dashur, and he made these two magnificent pyramids. And the bent pyramid, as I mentioned, has these two different angles. So one angle is like, I think 53 or 54 degrees, and then it goes up to like 47 or 43 degrees. It's two different angles, and the horizontal line is so finely cut. They're not sure if this was, what was the reason for it, what was the purpose behind it, but it was high craftsmanship. This wasn't just something that was just kind of a fluke. It was certainly a certain level of craftsmanship and skill that went into building this. And the reason why they had the different, inclines, I don't know. We don't know, but it is something that stands out when you look at the horizon over there in the northern part of ancient Kemet, near what would have been the ancient city of Memphis or Hecate, that whole area. This stands out in the horizon. This is something that jumps out at you. And he did not only the bent pyramid. So the famous bent pyramid is a credit to Snefru, Khufu's dad. He also had this other pyramid, this red pyramid, if you will, this huge pyramid that when you look at it, it is a remarkable pyramid. It has at its base, it has at each side, if you can kind of look at the bottom and imagine it, is about 220 meters long. So the base on each side is about 220 meters. The pyramid of his son Khufu, the Great Pyramid, is a little bit larger than it. Has 230 meters as its base on each side. So it's a significant pyramid. It's a large pyramid, and I guess his son hit him a little bit better. Did a little bit larger, a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit taller, a little bit wider. But he is, somebody who kind of set the standard that his son obviously followed. We think about the Great Pyramid of Khufu, obviously, of course, because it's iconic, right? It's one of the world's, one of the wonders of the world. We think about that, but his father actually built this pyramid and these pyramids, the red pyramid in Dashur and the bent pyramid, as you can see, they're in the background, they're in Dashur, as well as another pyramid he's credited with building. So sloped shapes, if you will, for the tombs that were being built before that. They took it a step further, literally with the step pyramids, and King Snefru apparently took it even further than that and began to build these types of pyramids. So he's famous for kind of advancing that architecture of pyramids, if you will. And, another thing we talk about, he is he's this guy's granddaddy. He's the grandfather of Khafre. So it is believed that the Sphinx is something that is of Khafre, and his granddaddy is Snefru. So Khufu is his father, and then his Khafre is the grandson of Snefru. So Snefru comes down in history for significant reasons, from the things he did with the pyramid and his architecture, the wisdom literature that was written underneath him, the documentation in the Palermo stone with respect to Snefru, and the fact that we find other things that make you think that there were people from different societies all over in ancient Kemet, even from the very beginning, even beyond that, we know that. So I just wanted to share that. I'd love to hear your comments about Snefru. If you have more questions, let me know. I'm going to try to make this available to those who are members, paid members on YouTube and Facebook. But I want to thank you so much, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. Please like this and share with somebody, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.